Hello and welcome to this special edition of DW News Africa. We're in South Africa, where the most contested election in the country's history is taking place. We're asking what's gone wrong here and who can fix it. It's been 30 years since the end of white minority rule, and the party of Nelson Mandela has been in power here ever since. But the ANC is in trouble. The tide may be turning on the party, and Africa's oldest liberation movement is fighting to maintain its political dominance.
The ANC government is failing us. Since 1994, ANC promises our grandparents the better land. Even now, ANC is still promising, but nothing is going on.
The corruption in the country, the crime in the country, the fact that the people are still living in poverty. And we have been voting for freedom for the ANC, and now it's time to vote for change.
People suffer a lot, especially in terms of unemployment. Personally, myself speaking, I have peers who are graduates already, but it's tough.
That's because South Africa is in serious decline. Unemployment, poverty and inequality have robbed many South Africans, mostly blacks, of a dignified standard of living. The biggest opposition party says it can do a better job, but it's not convincing enough voters. So what is the Democratic Alliance's problem? And with dozens of hopefuls on the ballot, new players are changing the political scene. Polls show them making ground, winning over voters, disenchanted with the established parties. I'm Christine Mundwa. It's good to have your company. I've reported on a number of elections in South Africa, but the general election set for May 29th feels different. There is a strong sense here that the result will be a game changer. The African National Congress has ruled for 30 years. It's now facing its toughest electoral challenge yet. A growing number of South Africans are dissatisfied with the state the country is in, and they blame the ANC, the key actor in bringing about South Africa's freedom after dark years of oppressive white minority rule. Here's a brief look back at the era known as apartheid. In the racially segregated South Africa, black people were second-class citizens. The highest status in society was reserved for white people who were descendants of Dutch and British settlers. They had privileged access to the best of the country's public facilities. The segregation, officially known as apartheid, began in 1948, but it was rooted in the country's history of colonization. Apartheid law required black people to carry a passbook, which stipulated where they were permitted to work and travel. The system condoned the harassment of black people.
I am coming. Don't take me. Under what section are you holding us? What do you think you're doing? I'm taking it. What are you doing? Come. Under what section are you holding us? Don't push me.
The government did not tolerate dissent, but that didn't stop people from showing their opposition. There were frequent mass demonstrations to which police responded with lethal force. In 1960, South African police opened fire on thousands of demonstrators in Sharpeville Township, killing 69 people. A year later, Nelson Mandela and the ANC took up the armed struggle against apartheid. For this, he and his comrades were branded terrorists and later sentenced to life in prison. But the resistance continued inside South Africa and around the world. By the 1990s, much of the legislation that formed the foundation of the apartheid system had been repealed, making the way for South Africa's first inclusive and democratic election in 1994. The ANC won that election, making Nelson Mandela the country's first black president.
Please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
The country was full of hope and promise. Blacks and whites who had long been divided were united. And the ANC would continue to dominate South Africa's politics with overwhelming majority support at the ballot box. By any measure, the ANC's electoral success over the past 30 years has been phenomenal, starting high under Nelson Mandela and rising to stellar levels under Thabo Mbeki's all-time high, just shy of 70% 20 years ago. Even the decline under Jacob Zuma is relative, and the low watermark of 58% under Cyril Ramaphosa is a result most democratically elected parties can only dream of. But this time, the ANC is facing an uncertain future. Polls point to a result under 50% and the loss of its absolute majority.
The smell of rubbish mixes with sewage. It's a powerful cocktail that residents have gotten used to living with. This is a familiar sight across South Africa's township areas where many black citizens live. President Cyril Ramaphosa visited this area to campaign for votes. We joined him as he interacted with residents, listening to their concerns. This lifetime ANC supporter was happy to see Ramaphosa, so he could tell him exactly how bad it is here.
There's feces running through the streets. Sewage water is flowing freely here. We often don't have any electricity here. It goes off for long periods, even for a month sometimes. Those are the things that cause us frustration.
Also causing frustration is the country's high unemployment rate. 40% of people old enough to work are without jobs. South Africans are also experiencing a crippling electricity crisis. At its worst, some areas went without power for over 8 hours a day.
Imagine paying 5 times the market price for a roll of toilet paper. That's what public power utility Eskom was shelling out. It's been revealed that it was regularly overpaying for basic supplies. It's the kind of maladministration that has left South Africans furious. Tenders have been used by business people with cozy relationships to the ANC to enrich themselves, leaving a litany of corruption scandals.
For reasons like these, the ANC is in big trouble. Pre-election polls suggest support for the party could even drop below 50%.
Those are predictions. Those are polls. We know what's going to happen. And the people in this hall and the people of South Africa know in their own hearts of hearts what they are going to do in terms of giving the ANC an overwhelming majority.
But the majority of voters in this election are young South Africans who grew up under the ANC administration. Although housing, the water supply and sanitation may have improved during their lifetimes, they're unhappy about their poor economic prospects.
Young people won't vote for the ANC because we're unemployed. It will be painful for them because new parties are going to come and take votes from them. The new parties are responding to our needs as young people, but the ANC seems to be stuck in the past. They're not looking after our needs.
That unhappiness is expected to cost the ANC dearly at the polls. The ANC leadership says the party has turned over a new leaf and should not be judged on past governance failures. On the 29th of May, South Africans will give their assessment of whether they think the ANC can truly turn things around.
Good girl, good girl.
But after 3 decades in power, the ANC is suffering a wide range of electoral ills. I spoke with the ANC's Youth League President Collen Malatji and asked him about the worst one, corruption.
Those who are corrupt we don't deserve to be in the ANC. That's why in the ANC we have set up systems for that. In the ANC, if you are charged, not even found guilty, if you are charged of corruption, we request you to step aside as a member of the ANC. If you're in government, we request you to step aside as a deployee of the ANC until you clear your name. Those are steps we're taking because we've acknowledged as the ANC that part of our problems that we've faced over time is that our political organization has been associated with corruption. And we've spoken about, we went to conference and said that enough is enough. Those who are corrupt must leave organization because obviously we're bound to attract corrupt characters because we're a ruling party. You know, any ruling party in the world attracts corrupt characters because you've got access to resources, you've got access to the influence. Now, not everyone that comes to the organization tend to be there to serve the people and advance the agenda of the ruling party.
We're at a time where geopolitical relations around the world are shifting. You have power centers emerging all over the world. I know that it's been a long-held ambition of the ANC to break Western hegemony. Young people in this continent are having to decide between the Eastern and the Western alliance, so to say. Do you think South Africa should pivot more to allying with Eastern powers, like China and Russia, as opposed to the West?
Look, the East has taken most posture supporting our posture. But also even the West, they've invested a lot of resources, some of the resources here. A lot of export and imports, trade agreements are mostly with the West. Now, I'm saying that the only thing that we don't want from all of these countries is that we don't want to be babysitted. We don't want elder brother, elder sister relationship. We want anyone who's ready, who ideologically agrees with the posture of the ANC, ready to assist South Africa to be built. We'll work with them.
There is some polling suggesting that your party, the ANC, for the first time might struggle to win a majority in this election. The fact that that's even part of the conversation, isn't that a daunting prospect?
We've never been under attack like before. The ANC is more under attack than ever now. Now, I think it's a wake-up call. And one thing about the ANC, if you can check its history, every time the ANC is under attack, it comes out stronger than before.
President Malatji, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
In this election, for the first time in 30 years, the ANC will lose its majority, but they will do anything to stay in power. Imagine a coalition between the ANC, the violent EFF, and the Zuma faction. Under this coalition of corruption, life will only get worse. This election is about survival. Unite to rescue South Africa. Vote DA.
You just saw a campaign video from the Democratic Alliance. It is promising to rescue South Africa from the ANC, a controversial tactic from the main opposition party, which won 21% of the national vote in the 2019 election. But it has only governed at provincial level. It runs the Western Cape. DW's Diane Hawker travelled to Cape Town to look at the party's record and what it has to offer.
A South African city like no other. Cape Town is home to over 4 million people, and the numbers keep growing. The city has become an investment hub and a sought-after relocation destination for South Africans and foreigners. It's one of the few places where jobs are steadily growing, largely due to a booming tourism industry. It's also different because it's not run by the ANC, but by the opposition Democratic Alliance. The DA says many of the successes in Cape Town and the Greater Western Cape province are due to its policy interventions. It believes it can replicate this success in the rest of South Africa and rescue the country from what it says is 30 years of ANC mismanagement. But there's another side of Cape Town, a side where residents struggle to find decent, affordable accommodation. Rents in Cape Town are up to 40% higher than in Johannesburg. Informal settlements like this one have sprung up all across Cape Town. Residents who live here say they want to be close to public transport routes and close to the city centre where the jobs are located. They say there simply isn't enough social housing available and are concerned that the prices for rental in other areas are simply too high. Life here means living without many basic needs, leading some residents to feel let down by the DA administration.
We don't have electricity, we don't have water, and we also don't have toilets. These things are quite important to all people.
Jonas says the DA's track record has not yet convinced him to vote for it.
The DA does seem to be trying to deliver, but there's many people in the Western Cape. It's trying, but we're not really satisfied.
DA leader John Steenhuisen has taken his party's Rescue South Africa message across the country, mainly focusing on areas that have traditionally voted for the ANC. He knows the party needs to attract these voters if it is to overtake the ruling party at the polls. But what about those who are uncertain about the DA's track record in the Western Cape?
You're not going to get everything right overnight. It's going to take some time. We have deep spatial inequality and economic inequality that still exists in South Africa years after apartheid. And absolutely, the Western Cape is not perfect. It's still got a lot to do, and that's why we're saying there's lots more to do.
South African voters have made it clear that beyond promises, they will judge parties in this election on their track records. The Democratic Alliance will have to show voters that it works for citizens of all backgrounds if it wants to unseat the ANC.
The EFF is the only alternative that we have in the political arena in South Africa. The EFF is the one that I relate to, is the one that talks about the problems, the issues on the ground, is the one that addresses the issues that the people are facing, the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed.
I think EFF represents me. So all their policies, I think they working for me. So that's why I said, let me come and support the party.
EFF have given me something that ANC have never given me. I'm 35 and nobody's going to hire me. But with EFF, I have hope.
Of the top three placed parties, only one is expected to grow its share of the vote, the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF. It has been very deliberate in courting young voters. The EFF is led by 43-year-old Julius Malema, who rose to prominence as the ANC Youth League leader between 2008 and 2010. The party's focus on land redistribution has been a major drawcard to young voters, many of whom believe the ANC sold out during negotiations with apartheid leaders.
The emphasis on land derives from the fact that 30 years down the line, 80% of the land is in the hands of the whites. Jobs is informed by the fact that joblessness in South Africa today sit at more than 15 million people who are capable to work. And our emphasis on now is because our suffering is happening now.
There are dozens of political parties standing in this election, many of them new, profiting from voters' hopes for change, hopes that cannot be fulfilled by the three big parties. Songezo Zibi is the leader of the RISE Mzansi party. I caught up with him in Soweto and asked him about his plan to make informal settlements a thing of the past.
There is no plan for proper, densely built communities which do not become ghettos because they've got the right facilities, they're closer to economic centers where people can work within a short distance and so on. It's chaos, right? So if there's proper planning, we believe that within 15 to 20 years, you really can eliminate the problem, but you have to plan properly, take account of the data, and make the tough decisions we need to take in order to get there.
Land is a big issue in South Africa, and it's in your manifesto, land reform. Yes. How do you propose rolling out a policy of land reform here in South Africa?
So for us, by the way, it's not land reform. It's spatial justice and spatial planning. It falls within that context. We've just spoken about growing population, historical land injustice, and urbanization. It's a very simple question. Where are South Africans moving, right? What do they need when they get there? They need public amenities, they need physical network infrastructure, and so on. One of the instruments that is provided in our constitution is expropriation of land with compensation. The government has not done it because there is no plan. Because the constitution says you must expropriate for a public purpose. So you must be clear why you need the land. You identify it, it's in the context of a plan, you expropriate, you pay the owner, an amount of money that is fair, and you provide the services that you need to provide to people. But of course, it's made some people very unhappy.
Yes, but isn't it a more popular view that this expropriation should happen without compensation? Can the South African state afford to compensate people whose land is taken?
So let me give you a sense of why compensation is important. In rural areas, you have lots of rural landowners. When you say there must be expropriation without compensation, and you empower, as the ANC wanted to do, mid-level government officials to make an expropriation decision, and you are in a corrupt society, you're going to get some poor family that owns land having its land arbitrarily expropriated by a corrupt official, and they can't afford to have the lawyers that are going to fight the case for them. The problem with populism is that this has been positioned as a black-white issue. I must tell you, go to rural areas and tell people you're going to give the government the power to take their land without compensation. You will have a small war going. Right? It's not a black and white issue. But pay people what is fair. Don't allow profiteering in the process of acquiring land.
Dr. Sithembile Mbete, it's really good to be talking to you on Deutsche Welle, DW News Africa. We appreciate your time. The ANC has a legacy as a liberation struggle party. After 30 years in power, what is the ANC's record as a governing party?
Well, I think that the ANC has a mixed record as a governing party. I think that certainly there's been a lot that's been achieved since 1994, especially given the extent of inequality and social conflict that there was before 1994. And so going from that base, I think that there is a great deal that the ANC can be proud of and has achieved. If you think that in 1994, 96, the first census after the 1994 elections, about 65% of South Africans lived in formal dwellings, so in like brick houses or flats. By the 2022 census, it was about 88%. If you consider access to electricity, access to water, access to schooling, access to housing, there's been a massive improvement in at least Black people's lives since 1994 compared to the past. I think that the ANC, while the ANC has been in government, while there was rapid improvement between 1994 and about 2009-10, what you've seen since then has been a decline in the delivery of services, in maintenance. So even though people have got access to water, you're not always going to get water when it comes out of your tap, right? So you've got all the plumbing that's coming to you, but it's not operating reliably. Or the same with electricity. You know, we've got we've got far greater access to electricity than we had in 1994, but it's not reliable. And so what we've seen in the last sort of 15 years or so has been a decline in the provision of some of the things that the ANC had expanded so rapidly to the majority of the population since 1994. Of course, we've also had all sorts of controversies around corruption, around, poor governance. And so the ANC's record, that's why I say it's a mixed one that is combined, that has a great deal of progress and trying to create a normal society out of a situation that was deeply abnormal and dysfunctional, but that also has been corrupted along the way.
So Nelson Mandela was the first president of the ANC. He hands over to Thabo Mbeki, and there we really see the ANC at the height of its electoral power and dominance. After President Thabo Mbeki comes President Jacob Zuma, and you start to see the decline. It's a very visible decline. What would have happened then? Why do the voters start turning on the ANC, if I can put it that way?
Well, remember that what the 2009 election comes after the ANC's elective conference in 2007, which was the one that had pitched then president of the ANC against his former deputy president, Jacob Zuma, and Jacob Zuma won. And so that elective conference of the ANC effectively split the party. And so a lot of the decline that you see in 2009 is people that were supporters of President Mbeki then voting for other parties, primarily COPE, which was started by former members of President Mbeki's cabinet and his supporters. And so that's the first split that you really see in the ANC, or the first definitive split that you see in 2009. And that's why you see this shift. I mean, what you do see, though, is that in a province like KwaZulu-Natal, which is Jacob Zuma's home province, you see the ANC doing incredibly well, so doing better in KZN in 2009 than it had ever done before, right? Because that was an area where Jacob Zuma was able to consolidate a great deal of support. So that's what you see in 2009. And then, of course, then from then, you have seen a steady decline, about 4-5 percentage points at a time, in both the general elections, so the national and provincial elections, and then also the local elections, which happen separately. They happen, there's about 2 years in between the general elections and the local elections. And so you do see a decline over time, and that is linked to what I had spoken about earlier, about the decline in services, the increase in corruption scandals, and this general just disgruntlement with the ANC.
Right. This is one of the most hotly contested elections that I can remember. But tell us, what is at stake in this election for South Africa?
Look, I think that this election is the first election since 1994 where the outcome is uncertain. And I think that's a good thing. When we talk about how democracies consolidate, democracy consolidates when power changes hands at national level. But, you're on the road to consolidation when the outcomes are uncertain. And I think that this is the first election where it's not a given that the ANC, it's not taken for granted that the ANC is going to win at national level. And even if it does win, it's not taken for granted how it'll win by and how great support, how great its support is going to be. The second thing about this election, I think that is consequential for the country, is that this is the first election. I think there's about 40% of the voters' roll is people who were born after 1990, which is when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, when the ANC and other liberation movements were unbanned. So we are having more and more of the voting population be people who don't remember apartheid in any real sense, and what that then means around their electoral choices and around their vision of what the future of the country should be, I think is going to be really interesting to see from these elections who does that demographic of voter choose to support and why. And then the third thing, of course, is that I think that given the very extensive kind of governance challenges that we're facing and economic challenges as well that we're facing, some of them that are unique to South Africa, but others, like cost of living, that are being ventilated in elections all over the world this year. I think that, who wins, how they win, and who becomes the government is going to be really, really important for seeing how we deal, and try to solve some of the economic problems that we face. And then the last thing is that I think that this election is going to be the first election since 1994 where there's a real regional or provincial, where there's real provincial and differences in the outcome. So where KwaZulu-Natal seems likely to end up being a coalition government for the government of that province, same with Gauteng province, which is the economic heartland of the country, same possibly with the Western Cape. So we're going to be seeing a lot more kind of regional differentiation, and that will probably have consequences for how government happens.
What are the opposition parties, when you assess the offering from the opposition parties, is there a solid message there? Is there really an alternative? Or are opposition parties saying to South Africans, we are not the ANC and it's time for change? Is there something really solid from your assessment? Because one of the challenges we have on the continent is sometimes there's criticism of how the opposition positions itself. It's really eloquent in messaging to the population that we need change, but it's never really clear what change opposition is capable of. Do you get a sense from the offering in this election that there is really a promise of change if South Africans were to bring in a new player?
I think that the opposition has been incredibly weak in South Africa, and the ANC has been allowed to get away with a lot that it shouldn't have been able to, or wouldn't have been able to, if we had more compelling opposition parties. And that's partly because the ANC had always set itself up as kind of a broad church that could be a home for different races, classes, people from all over the country. And South Africa is a massive country geographically. And there's no opposition party that's managed to come up to compete with that. And instead, I think that what we've seen and what we can see in this election is that we've got very sort of one-issue opposition parties, or parties that are appealing to particular racial groups or ethnic groups or religious groups, and aren't really coming to South Africans with a message that says that, no, we're not just different from the ANC, but this is our vision for what the country should be and what it'll look like and where we're going to take it forward. And the risk with that for the opposition is that the closer and closer you get to the election, the more people then lean on an idea of, well, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And if the opposition isn't offering a compelling vision of what South Africa is, what it can be without the ANC, then unfortunately, I don't think that there's going to be any big rival, that they're going to be very successful actually in trying to rival the ANC in an election.
Let's talk about South Africa as a geopolitical actor, so to say, perhaps starting in the region and on the continent of Africa, where it is the most industrialized country, the second largest economy, second to Nigeria, but certainly a leading economy, if not the leading economy on the continent. What is South Africa's standing on the African continent under the ANC's leadership?
Well, I think that the South Africa's standing on the continent under the ANC has fluctuated, right? And so you had the Mandela moment and what moral authority that came with. You had Thabo Mbeki, who was very committed actually to the governance of the continent. He saw himself very much as a Pan-Africanist. He developed a Pan-African foreign policy for South Africa, investing in the transformation of the OAU to the AU, investing in peacekeeping and mediation on the continent, and really trying to position position South Africa as a representative of the African continent in other international fora, whether that was the G7 or the G20. And then under Jacob Zuma, you saw South Africa's standing in the continent decline a bit, just because he wasn't as interested in issues of continental governance. He was far more interested in South Africa's participation in the BRICS and in those kinds of forums. And so you didn't have South Africa really giving much leadership from the government in intergovernmental organizations on the continent. What you've seen under President Ramaphosa is a bit of a return to the Mbeki era foreign policy. South Africa, or President Ramaphosa chaired the AU during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, that first year of the pandemic, and was really instrumental in driving the effort to get vaccines for the continent and supporting Africa's CDC, and in also, trying to get the G20 countries to either cancel or to suspend debt repayments for African states, which was successful. And so what you've seen since 2019 under President Ramaphosa is South Africa playing a bit more of that leadership role on the continent. We have just sent troops to the DRC to try to, support the peace building efforts there, or peacemaking efforts there. And then, of course, the ICJ case, South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ for genocide in Gaza. And so you've seen South Africa really, exert itself far more in the last few years.
And I wanted to pick up on that because you talked about BRICS. There is also the position of neutrality that South Africa maintains as it pertains to the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and that aggression. Are we likely to see South Africa continue on this path of perhaps embracing other allies around the world and maybe less engagement with the West, asserting itself in this messaging that the ANC has been putting out, that Western hegemony really needs to be broken down? Can we expect that would continue whatever happens after this election?
Look, I think an important thing to start off with is to say that this has been the ANC's position since before 1994. Nelson Mandela, in many of his speeches, speaks against Western hegemony, speaks against US dominance of the global governance system. So this position is not a different one. There's been no change since 1994. This has always been how the ANC has postured. But of course, the ANC governs a country that has always had very strong links to the West, both economically, militarily, and politically. And that doesn't just end, right? That continues. And so a lot of what the ANC has tried to do over the last 30 years is this balancing act of, on the one hand, being very critical of the West's positioning on certain issues and its infringement on the sovereignty of poorer countries in the world, while at the same time needing to manage relations with countries like Germany that are major industrial and trading partners. And it's a very difficult balancing act, but that has been more successful at some times than not, and not in others. But I think that we can expect that to continue for as long as the ANC is the governing party. One of the weaknesses of our opposition parties is that they don't really have positions on foreign policy. So if you look at the manifestos of the opposition parties, there's nothing really on foreign policy in any of those. So by default, even if there was an opposition coalition that was in charge, there'd actually end up being a great deal of continuity because they'd have to be developing a foreign policy on the fly. And so I think that we're likely to see a lot more continuity. I think the second thing that's really important is that as much as South Africans in general are dissatisfied with the ANC's governance domestically, there's a great deal of domestic support for the ANC government's international position. So the position on neutrality in Ukraine is a generally popular position. The majority of South Africans didn't want South Africa to take a side on either side of that conflict. The position on Palestine is a generally popular one. And so the irony, of course, is where populations generally aren't interested in foreign policy, elections aren't fought on foreign policy. The one area of ANC governance that most people generally agree with is its foreign policy. Whether that'll make any difference in the election is another question. So I think that we can see a great deal of continuity. I also think that we are in a realignment of global power, right? Like the world is changing rapidly. which voices, were hurtling head first into sort of a multipolar order where different voices, many different voices, matter and can make an impact. And so in that, I think that there is a great deal in the ANC's foreign policy and ANC's international relations. I think that'll end up continuing no matter who is in charge. And then the last thing is that we are also hosting the G20 in 2025. And the planning for that is being done by an ANC government, regardless of who is then going to be in government after the election.
Dr. Mbete, you've got a very good sense of the beaten pulse of what is going on in this country, how people feel about issues, particularly as it pertains, as you say, to foreign policy. What could you say to capitals in the Western world, if we can put it this way, who are now engaged on this battle to reclaim, as they see it, hearts and minds in this part of the world, in countries like in South Africa, to try to win them over? We know that the president of Ukraine is planning a visit here precisely to try and court South Africa into its fold to win political support. So there is a sense that, at least from the Western perspective, that we're losing the global South, a very horrible term that offends a lot of people, but everyone knows what I mean by that. And they are now engaged in this effort to win back people in this part of this world. What would you say to people who are engaged in such an effort? Is it a lost cause? Is it worth it? Is this even how to look at it, essentially? How to approach it?
No, I think that the first thing I would say to people in the West that want to re-engage is that you need to engage with people as humans, not as aliens or as a different species to you, right? That part of what's at issue is the sense that the treatment of people in the world is fundamentally unequal, and that inequality is born of racism, of colonialism, of continued imperial relations. And so the life of a child in the DRC is worth less than the life of a child in Ukraine, if you judge by the statements of Western leaders. And so that's actually what you're trying to deal with, is, do people feel that you view them as human beings equal to you and to your children? And from that, if you're then dealing with somebody as an equal human being, then you engage with their opinions respectfully. You try to understand their perspective. You don't dismiss it. You don't try to chide them or tell them off for what they're doing or not. And then you try to engage and actually persuade. And don't take it for granted that what you believe to be morally correct is what they should also believe to be morally correct. And I think that that is the big hurdle that faces the Western world and Western leaders in particularly. And then finally, I think that a lot more needs to be invested in getting young people to know, Western young people, ironically, with all of the social media that we have and all of this connection digitally, there's actually, I think, far less people-to-people engagement between young Westerners and young Africans than there probably ever has been. And so when young people's only view of Westerners is exploitative corporates, is Western leaders telling them off or telling off their governments, is aid workers who are abusive and doing terrible things to them, then of course they're not going to have a very good view on the West in any way. And so I think that they, to win hearts and minds, you've actually got to engage the hearts and minds.
Bringing this to a close, there is a sense from the outside looking in that South Africa is on the decline. Is that an accurate assessment of things from somebody who's speaking from the inside? The headlines that come out of the country, right? The headline numbers, in terms of, you know, the economic growth and all the blows to that. I know some of those factors are external, but there is just this sense that that promise that this country had at the dawn of its democracy, that promise is gone. Is that a real sense? Is that an accurate sense that somebody would have from the outside in?
Look, I think that South Africa has not lived up to the promise of 1994, and is certainly, I think, in many areas on the decline in terms of being able to provide for the people that live here. But I think that normality will be good for South Africa. I think being this miracle of 1994 and this, you know, relatively peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy has been a major, big, heavy yoke to carry for the country and for the people that live here, because the expectation of what South Africa is and could be has often been completely out of touch with the reality of what it is and what it was recovering from to become. And so I think that a dose of healthy expectations is a good thing for South Africa. And I think that one of the major kind of hurdles and what I would like to see being focused on from now is to really attempt to attack the deep inequality that is in this country. Because the reality is that the country is in some ways more unequal than it was in 1994. The people that were wealthy in 1994 have only become wealthier. You've still got massive disparities between white people and black people's quality of life. And a young person who was born in 1994 can't see very much what is better about 2024 to 1984. Whereas for me, who was born in 1984, I saw and I lived through a dramatic improvement in my life and my life chances. And we need to give that back to kids who are living now. And I think part of that means being really realistic about what South Africa is, what it can achieve, and not trying to live up to some image of being a miracle state. Even Nelson Mandela said he was not a saint and he didn't want to be treated as one. And I don't think that South Africa should be treated like a country of saints. South Africa is a normal country with deep problems, many historical, but also many created in the present. And I'm looking forward to us having the time and the space to deal with the reality of who South Africa is, not who the international community imagines it or wants it to be.
That's all for this special edition of DW News Africa on the South African elections 30 years after the end of apartheid. We'll leave you with the voices of the people who have the final say, South African voters on their hopes for the future. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
You know, so much has changed here in South Africa. The ANC is going to win. I'm positive because the ANC is going to win. People can see the change.
Education is the key. If only our children can persevere and get educated, there will be significant change, even better than what we saw in 1994.
South Africa is beautiful and there's more that can be done to South Africa. And I believe us as the youth coming up, we have so much brilliant ideas to change our country.
Yeah, I feel like the culture is so diverse, but Cape Town people are friendly. I feel like we all like working together. Yeah, it's just a friendly nation, so yeah.